Chapter 2 of The Romance of Plant Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eva Stays. The Romance of Plant Life by George Francis Scott-Elliot. Chapter 2 on Savages, Doctors, and Plants. Savages knew botany. First lady doctors and botanical excursions, true drugs and horrible ornaments, hydrophobia cures, cloves, mustard, ivy, roses and teeth, how to keep hair on, how to know if a patient will recover, curious properties of a mushroom, the Scythian lamb, quinine, history and use, safflower, Romance of Ipecacuanha, Wars of the Spice Trade, Cinnamon, Dogwood, and Indigo, Romance of Pepper, Babylonian and Egyptian Botanists, Chinese Discoveries, Theophrastus, Medieval Times, the First Illustrated Book, Numbers of Plants Known, Discoveries of Painters and Poets. If we look back to the time when all men and women were mere savages, living like the Eskimo or the Australians of today, then it is certain that every person was much interested in plants. Nothing was so interesting as daily food, because no one was ever certain of even one good meal in the day. So that in those early times there was a very sound, well-grounded knowledge of roots, bulbs, and fruits. They knew all that were good to eat, all that could possibly be eaten in times of famine and starvation, and also every poisonous and unwholesome plant. Some savage genius must have discovered that certain plants were good medicine, that certain tree barks helped to check fever, and that others were worth trying when people had successfully devoured more than they could comfortably digest. The life of a savage meant tremendous meals, followed by days of starvation. Even now, when young children are fed on rice in India, a thread is tied round their waist, and, when this bursts, they are not allowed to eat any more. Very probably, some of these early physicians were lady doctors, usually of a certain age. Men were too busy with their hunting and warfare to have time to try experiments with drugs, to make concoctions of herbs, all more or less disquieting, and to find out if these were of any use. So that such medicine men or witches gradually came to understand enough about poisons or fruit to make themselves respected and even feared. They would, no doubt, make botanical excursions in the forest, accompanied by their pupils, in order to point out the poisonous and useful drugs. It is worth noting, in passing, that this habit of botanical professors going on excursions with medical students has persisted down to our own times, probably without any break in the continuity. But it was soon found advisable to make this knowledge secret and difficult to get. They did not really know so very much, and a mysterious, solemn manner, and a quantity of horrible and unusual objects placed around the hut would perhaps prevent some irate and impatient savage patient from throwing a spear at his wizard or witch doctor. Footnote: this is still the custom in huts of the wizard or medicine men in West Africa, where one finds small cushions stuck over with all sorts of poisonous plants, bits of human bones, and other loathsome accessories. End footnote. Shakespeare alludes to this in Macbeth. Scale of dragon, tooth of wolf, witch's mummy, maw and gulf of the ravened salt sea shark, root of hemlock digged in the dark, gall of goat and slips of yew, and so on. Most of their cures were faith cures, and they were, no doubt, much more likely to be successful when the patient believed he was being treated with some dreadful stew of all sorts of wonderful and horrible materials. This explains how it was that the knowledge of medicine became so mixed up with pure charlatanism and swindling that no man could tell which drugs were of real use and which were mere ornaments giving piquancy and flavor to the prescription. It is not possible to say that a snake's head, the brain of a toad, the gall of a crocodile, and the whiskers of a tiger were all of them absolutely useless. Within the last few years it has been found that an antidote to snake bite can be obtained from a decoction of part of the snake itself. and it has also been discovered that small quantities of virulent poisons are amongst our most valuable and powerful remedies. Whether the savages and their successors, the doctors of feudal times, even down to the 15th and 16th centuries, suspected or believed that this was the case must remain a rather doubtful hypothesis. But there is no question that the hair of the dog that bit him theory of medicine was very prevalent. The following was a cure for hydrophobia of a more elaborate nature. I learned of a friend who had tried it effectual to cure the biting of a mad dog. Take the leaves and roots of cowslips, of the leaves of box and pennyroyal, of each a like quantity, shred them small to put them into hot broth, and let it be so taken 3 days together, and apply the herbs to the bitten place with soap and hog suet melted together. Parkinson. This prescription is not so preposterous as it sounds. Box and pennyroyal both contain essences which would be in all probability fatal to the germs of hydrophobia, and the soap and hog suet would keep air from the wound. Other prescriptions read like our modern patent medicines. Good cloves comfort the brain and the virtue of feeling, and help also against indigestion and ache of the stomach. Bartholomew. Senvey, the old name of mustard, healeth smiting of serpents, and overcometh venom of the scorpion, and abateth toothache, and cleanseth the hair, and letteth, that is, prevents or tending to prevent the falling thereof. If it be drunk fasting, it make the intellect good. Even in those days, the people can scarcely have believed that drinking mustard improved the intellect. Many of the remedies and cures are obviously false. For example, the following. A man crowned with ivy cannot get drunk. Powder of dry roses comforteth wagging teeth that be in point to fall. The fact that the surgeon was also a barber and also a face specialist appears from 2 of the following. Leaves of chestnut burnt to powder and tempered with vinegar, and laid to a man's head plaster-wise, maketh hair increase and keepeth hair from falling. Those whose hair turned grey could employ the following prescription. Leaves of mulberry sod in rain-water maketh black hair. If a doctor was not quite sure of their endurance of a patient under these heroic remedies, he could easily find out if he would recover, for it was only necessary to try the following. Celandine with the heart of a mouldwarp, that is, mole, Scotus moldywort, laid under the head of one that is grievously sick. If he be in danger of death, immediately he will cry out with a loud voice or sing. If not, he will weep. In Lightfoot's Flora Scotia, there is an interesting account of the fly mushroom, Agaricus muscaris, which is not very rare in Britain, and which may easily be recognized by the bright red top or cap with whitest scales scattered over it, and a sort of ring of loose white tissue around the stalk. It has an acrid and deleterious quality. From the inhabitants of Kamschatka prepare a liquor from an infusion of this agaric, which has taken a small quantity, exhilarates the spirits, but in a larger dose brings on a trembling of the nerves, intoxication, delirium, and melancholy. Linnaeus informs us that flies are killed, or at least stupefied, by an infusion of this fungus in milk, and that the express juice of it anointed on bedsteads and other places effectually destroys what we may describe as a certain lively and pertinacious insects with great affection for man. As a matter of fact, the fungus is said to be a deadly poison. These quotations are enough to show how the real medical knowledge of those times was encrusted with all sorts of faith-curing devices, sheer falsehoods, and superstitions. The most learned men of the Middle Ages were almost invariably monks and hermits, for there was nothing in the world of those strenuous times to attract a studious, sensitive disposition. The spirits of their learning can be judged from the wearisome disquisitions in lengthy volumes written about the barnacle goose and the Scythian lamb. In certain deserts along the Volga River in Russia, a peculiar fern may be found. It might be described as resembling a gigantic polypody. The stem is about as thick as a lamb's body, and grows horizontally on the ground like that of the common fern mentioned. Thick, furry scales cover the outside of its stem, which ends at the tip in an elongated point. The blackish-green leaf stalk, springing from the furry stem, end in large divided green leaves. It occurred to some medieval humorists to cut off the upper part of the leafish stalks and to make a sort of toy lamb out of the 4 leaf stalk stumps and part of the woolly or furry stem. This was palmed off as a wonderful curiosity of nature, as a plant that became an animal, upon the ingenious tourist of the period. Such a subject was thoroughly congenial to the learned mind in the Middle Ages, and an enormous quantity of literature was produced in consequence. The general theory is given in the following lines. Cradled in snow and fanned by Arctic air shines gentle Baromet's thy golden hair, rooted in earth each cloven hoof descends, and round her flexible neck she bends. Crops the grey coral moss and hoary thyme, o'erlaps with rosy tongue the melting rime. Eyes with mute tenderness her distant dam, or seems to bleat a vegetable lamb. Such is the old idea of a well-known fern, Sebaceum barometz. Yet the original researches of some African Obi, wizard or Red Indian were not forgotten, and gradually came into practice. It must be remembered that these savages were true scientific experimentalists, and made discoveries which have been infinite service to mankind. We remember great men like Harvey, Lister, and Pasteur, but we never think of the Indian who discovered quinine. The quinine trees, the yellow variety of Calycea cinchona, grow in the mountains of northeastern Bolivia and southeastern Peru, in wild, inaccessible places at heights of 5,000 to 6,000 feet. The Indians probably experimented with almost every part of every wild tree before they discovered the wonderful properties of this particular species. The quinine in nature is probably intended to prevent some fungus or small insect from attacking the bark. When quinine is used in malaria, it kills the fever germ which attacks the blood corpuscles of the sick person, so that it is the utmost importance in all tropical countries. When the Jesuit fathers reached Peru and made friends and converts of the Indians, they discovered this remedy. Soon after, the Countess de Sicon, the wife of the Viceroy of Peru, fell seriously ill of fever, and was cured by the use of Jesuit's bark or quinine. It was introduced into Europe about 1638, but for a very long time the entire supply came from South America. The British Indian government were paying some £12,000 every year for South American quinine, and at the same time the supply was running short, for the Indians were cutting down every tree. At last, in 1859, on the suggestion of Dr. Royal, in 1839, the adventurous journeys of Clements Markham Spruce and Robert Cross resulted in the introduction of the cinchona, now flourishing in Madras, Bombay, and Ceylon. In 1897, British colonies produced about 43,415 pounds worth of quinine, and the price is now only 7.5 pennies or 8 pennies a pound. Such drugs as safflower are of very ancient date. It was commonly employed in Egypt with other dyes and spices for embalming mummies. It is now used with carbonate of soda and citric acid to give a pink dye to silks and satins, and occasionally, in the form of rouge, to ladies' cheeks. How did the ancient Egyptians discover that this particular thistle-like plant, Carthamus tinctoris, had flowers from which a red dye could be extracted by a tedious process of soaking in water? The natural color of the flower is not red, but yellow. The history of other drugs reads like a romance. Ipecacuanha, for instance, was discovered by some unknown Indian who lived in the damp tropical forests of Brazil and New Granada. A worthy merchant in Paris obtained a little of the drug in the way of trade. Shortly afterwards he became very ill, and was attended by a certain Dr. Helvetius, who was exceedingly attentive to him. The grateful merchant gave the kind-hearted physician some ipecacuanha. In the course of time, the great King Louis XIV's son fell ill of dysentery, and Helvetius received 1,000 louis d'or for his ipecacuanha. A very interesting and romantic history might be written about the effects of drugs, dyes, and spices in developing trade. During the time when Britain was struggling to obtain share of the foreign trade of Holland and France, such as spices of clove, cinnamon, and pepper were of the greatest importance. The Dutch especially adopted every possible method to keep the spice trade in their own hands. They cut down clove, cinnamon, and other trees in all the islands not directly under their control. They imposed the most barbarous penalties on any interloper. For instance, anyone who sold a single stick of cinnamon in Ceylon was punished with death. When the English captured the island in 1796, all such restrictions were of course repealed. Nevertheless, its cultivation remained a monopoly of the East India Company until 1832. Logwood, Haematoxylon campechianum, is closely connected to the story of adventure and colonization in the West Indies. Its use was at first forbidden by Queen Elizabeth, as it did not yield fast colors. This was because the dyers did not know of any mordant to fix them. Yet this is one of the few vegetable dyes which retain their position in the market in these days of aniline colors, and is said to be a large constituent with brandy of cheap port wine. Indigo was known to the Romans, who imported it from India on camelback by way of the Persian and Syrian desert. In the 15th century, when the Dutch began to introduce it in large quantities, it was found to interfere with the woad, Istasis tinctoria, which was then a very important cultivated plant in Europe. In Nuremberg, an oath was administered once a year to all the manufacturers and dyers, by which they bound themselves not to use the devil's dye, as they called indigo. Its more recent history shows a very different system. In Assam and other parts of British India, enormous sums of money have been invested in indigo plantations. It has been estimated that £4,000,000 was invested, and that a population of something like 700 Europeans and 850 workmen to the square mile in Bihar were entirely supported by indigo plantations. Now all these planters are ruined, and the population is dispersed because German indigo manufactured from coal tar is destroying the sale of the British-grown material. The plant has pretty blue flowers and belongs to the leguminous order. The dye is obtained by steeping the leaves and young branches in water, and it is finally turned out in blue powder or cakes. Perhaps the most interesting of all these drugs is pepper. The Dutch, in the days of Queen Elizabeth, had a monopoly of the East Indian trade, and they tried to cut down or burn all spice trees except those in their own control. They could thus form a corner in pepper and alter the price as they felt inclined. As one period they doubled the price, raising it from 3 shillings to 6 shillings per pound. This annoyed the London merchants so much that they met together and formed the Society of Merchants and Adventurers Trading to the East Indies. This was of course the original source of our great East Indian trade, and later on resulted in the Indian Empire. At present and for centuries the whole world is searched and explored for drugs and spices. Our medicinal rhubarb, for instance, grows in China on the frontiers of Tibet. It is carried over the mountains of China to Kyoto in Siberia, and from thence taken across the Russian Siberia to London and New York. It is closely allied to the common and garden rhubarb, which grows wild on the banks of the Volga. It is only our duty to remember with gratitude all those long since departed botanists who have made our lives so full of luxury and have supplied our doctors with all kinds of medicines. The first doctors were of course just savage botanists, but as soon as men began to write down their experiences, we find botanical treatises. The first, and for a very long time the only, botanical books were intended to teach medical students the names and how to recognize useful flowers and drugs. Medicinal herbs such as mandrake, garlic, and mint are found described on those clay cylinders which were used in Babylon instead of books, about 4000 BC. That's some 6,000 years ago. The Egyptians thought that kindly healing plants such as opium, almonds, figs, castor oil, dates, and olives were derived from the blood and tears of the gods. That would be about 3000 BC. It is not known how far back Chinese botany can be traced, but by the 12th century before Christ, some 300 plants were known, including ginger, licorice, rhubarb, and cinnamon. Theophrastus, who flourished about 300 BC, was a scientific botanist far ahead of his time. His notes about the mangroves in the Persian Gulf are still of some importance. It is said that some 2,000 botanical students attended his lectures. It is doubtful if any professor of botany has ever since that time had so large a number of pupils. Dioscorides, who lived about 64 BC, wrote a book which was copied by the Pliny 78 AD, who perished in the eruption of Vesuvius. The botany of the Middle Ages seemed to have been mainly that of Theophrastus and Dioscorides. In the 10th century we find an Arab, Ibn Sina, whose name has been commemorated in the name of a plant, Avicennia, publishing the first illustrated textbook, for he gave colored diagrams to his pupils. After this there was an exceedingly little discovery until comparatively recent times, but grew in 1682, and Malpighi in 1700 began to work with the microscope, and with the work of Linnaeus in 1731, modern botany was well started and ready to develop. It is interesting to compare the numbers of plants known at various periods, so as to see how greatly our knowledge has been increased of recent years. Theophrastus, 300 BC, knew about 500 plants. Pliny, 78 AD, knew about 1,000 species by name. Linnaeus in 1731 raised the number to 10,000. Sicardo in 1892 gives the number of plants then known as follows: flowering plants, 105,231 species; ferns, 2,819 species; horsetails and club mosses, 565 species; mosses, 4,609 species; liverworts, 3,041 species; lichens, 5,600 species; fungi, 39,663 species; seaweeds, 12,178 species; total 173,706 species. But during the years that have elapsed since 1892, many new species have been described, so that we may estimate that at least 200,000 species are now known to mankind. But it is in the inner meaning and general knowledge of the life of plants that modern botany has made the most extraordinary progress. It is true that we are still burdened with medieval terminology. There are such names as Galbulus, Amphisarca, and inferior Drupaceus pseudocarps, but these are probably disappearing. The great idea that plants are living beings, that every detail in their structure has a meaning in their life, and that all plants are more or less distant cousins descended from a common ancestor, have had extraordinary influence in overthrowing the unintelligent pedantry so prevalent until 1875. Yet there are many, not always botanists, of much older date, who have made great discoveries in the science. Leonardo da Vinci, the great painter, seems to have quite a definite idea of the growth of trees, for he found out that the annual rings on a tree stem are thin on the northern and thick on the southern side of the trunk. Dante have also understood the effects of sunlight in ripening the vine and producing the growth of the plants. Purgatorio, 2577. Goethe seems to have been almost the first to understand how leaves can be changed in appearance when they are intended to act in a different way. Petals, stamens, as well as some tendrils and spines, are all modified leaves. There is also a passage in Virgil, or perhaps more distinctly in Cato, which is held to show that the ancients knew that groups of plants, leguminoso, in some way improved the soil. I have also tried to show that Shelley had a more or less distinct idea of the warning or conspicuous colors, reds, purples, spotted, and speckled, which are characteristics of many poisonous plants. But if we begin with the unlettered savage, one can trace the very slow and gradual growth of the science of plant life, persisting all through the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, and recent times, until about 50 or 60 years ago, when a sudden great development began, which gives us, we hope, the promise of still more wonderful discoveries. End of chapter 2.